We left off in Isaiah chapter 13 last time, and we'd spent a good chunk of the last class kind of going over the introductory notes to this section. I've put some stuff up on the board. I don't know how well people can see this or how well this shows up, but what we have in chapters 13 through 27 is basically a series of oracles against the Gentile nations. And I suggested that it kind of breaks into three parts or three cycles. And you can look at the board and kind of figure out what some of the parallels for yourself. And you can read the text and decide what you think, whether this is a good outline or not. But in chapter 13, we're focusing primarily on the city of Babylon. And I suggested last time that Isaiah is really using Babylon not just to refer to the city itself, but more likely as a figure for really what is wrong with the world in general. And he applies it to Assyria at the very end when he introduces, when Assyria is basically brought into the picture without any transition or introduction of any kind. But in chapter 13, we have this summons to battle against the city of Babylon and the fall of the city described in these apocalyptic type terms. The oracle concerning Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amoz saw. Lift up a standard on the bare hill. Raise your voice to them. Wave the hand that they may enter the doors of the nobles. I have commanded my consecrated ones. I have even called my mighty warriors, to my proud exulting ones, to execute my anger. A sound of tumult on the mountains, like that of many people. A sound of the uproar of kingdoms, of nations gathered together. The Lord of hosts is mustering the army for battle. They are coming from a far country, from the farthest horizons, the Lord and His instruments of indignation to destroy the whole land. Now, you just read those opening 5 verses there. First of all, this is one of the last times that this book affirms that Isaiah is the author. In verse 1, he is mentioned a few more times in the narratives in chapters 36 through 39. But this is the last explicit statement that says that all these oracles are coming from Isaiah. Now, he describes a signal pole being lifted up, a standard being lifted up on the high hill. We saw this kind of thing earlier in chapter 5 and in chapter 11, where God summons the nations. In chapter 5, he was summoning the nations to do battle against Israel, particularly Assyria. He was summoning them to judge Israel. And in chapter 11, he summons the nations as a message of hope, to gather them together, to be one people for him. But here in chapter 13, God is summoning the nations once again. But not so that they can win a great battle, and not so that they can become part of a great people, but so that God can destroy them. The nations are at his beck and call. He refers to them in verses 3 through 5, these arrogant warriors, as the instruments of his indignation. It's like we saw in chapter 10. God said that Assyria is the rod of my anger. Assyria was not the one actually winning all of those battles. Assyria was not the one actually completing all of those conquests. Rather, Assyria was merely a tool being used for God's purpose. They were merely a vessel or an instrument that God was using to accomplish His will. Just like all of the nations are ultimately instruments of indignation to destroy the whole land or the whole earth. That expression at the end of verse 5, the whole land or the whole earth, bookends chapters 13 and 14 and the oracles against Babylon. You have this statement again in chapter 14 and verse 26, that this is the plan devised against the whole earth, and this is the hand that is stretched out against all the nations. For the Lord of hosts has planned, and who can frustrate it? And as for his stretched out hand, who can turn it back? All this is to say, we have this judgment coming on Babylon or Assyria is not just a judgment on one particular city or one particular nation, but ultimately is a model for judgment on the whole earth, the whole world. In verse 6, it says, "Wail, for the day of the Lord is near. It will come as destruction from the Almighty. Therefore all hands will fall limp, and every man's heart will melt. They will be terrified. Pains and anguish will take hold of them. They will writhe like a woman in labor. They will look at one another in astonishment, their faces aflame. Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, cruel, with fury and burning anger, to make the land a desolation. He will exterminate its sinners from it. For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not flash forth their light, The sun will be dark when it rises, and the moon will not shed its light. Thus I will punish the world for its evil, and the wicked for their iniquity. I will also put an end to the arrogance of the proud, and abase the haughtiness of the ruthless. I will make mortal man scarcer than pure gold, and mankind than the gold of Ophir. Therefore I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will be shaken from its place at the fury of the Lord of hosts in the day of his burning anger. That's pretty harsh. What is the day of the Lord? Anybody know what that is?
God visits.
God visit? You mean like like your grandmother might come to visit for tea and crumpets or whatnot?
I hope that's not what happens when your grandmother comes for tea and crumpets.
I don't know. Is that the kind of when the Bible speaks about God visiting, it's not talking about God coming over to visit the way you might visit your friends. God's visitation is always described in terms of judgment. Mark,
is it always in judgment, or is there not one or two places where it's to deliver the righteous or something of that nature?
That's a good point to bring up.
I forgot.
Okay, now the day of the Lord is an expression that appears in a lot of the prophets in the Old Testament. It appears in Amos 5 in verses 18 through 20. It appears in Obadiah once in verse 15. Zephaniah uses it a few times in Zephaniah chapter 1. But by and large, anybody know which prophet uses the term day of the Lord more than anybody else? Not Ezekiel, although Ezekiel uses it like once or twice, I think. Not Jeremiah. No, you're going after the big ones. You shouldn't be going after the big ones. Joel. Everybody always forgets about Joel. Joel, and I may have preached on this like a year or so back, but the prophet Joel uses the expression the day of the Lord more times than any other prophet in the Old Testament. Which, when you consider how short Joel is, that's a big deal. Joel uses it 5 times in his book. The whole book of Joel, I might say, is rightly about the day of the Lord. And so he kind of gets the lion's share of the references. But if you read Joel, the day of the Lord means 2 things in the book. It's a day of judgment, where the locusts come and eat everything, and this great army, the locusts are refigured as this great army that comes and destroys the land. But the day of the Lord can be a good thing, though. The day of the Lord can also be the day where God pours out His Spirit on all flesh, and the people receive a blessing as well. And so basically the question that Joel would pose then in that instance is that, which is it going to be for you? Is it going to be a day of judgment, or is it going to be a day of vindication? And the day of the Lord is not, just some specific event you can mark on your calendar. It's a time when God breaks into human history, and the wicked are punished and the righteous are saved. And those 2 things they go hand in hand. They are interchangeable. And so it's not a question of, is the day of the Lord only judgment on the wicked, or is the day of the Lord only blessing on the righteous? But it's really both of those because, they go together. You can't have one without the other. They're natural, logical consequences of each other. Now, this passage in Isaiah 13 is actually remarkably similar to some of the things that Joel says in Joel chapter 2. And I'll just kind of give you a little sampling here. In Joel chapter 2, he says, "Blow a trumpet in Zion and sound an alarm on my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming. Surely it is near, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness. As the dawn is spread over the mountains, so there is a great and mighty people. There has never been anything like it, nor will there be again after it to the years of many generations. A fire consumes before them. Behind them a flame burns. The land is like the Garden of Eden before them, but a desolate wilderness behind them. And nothing at all escapes them. Their appearance is like the appearance of horses. And like war horses, so they run. With a noise as of chariots, they leap on the tops of the mountains. Like the crackling of a flame of fire, consuming the stubble. Like a mighty people arranged for battle. Before them the people are in anguish. All faces turn pale. They run like mighty men. They climb the wall like soldiers, and they march in line. Nor do they deviate from their paths. They do not crowd each other. They do not march everyone in his path. When they burst through the defenses, they do not break ranks. They rush on the city. They run on the wall. They climb into the houses. They enter through the windows like a thief. He's talking about locusts here, by the way. In verse 10, before them the earth quakes, The heavens tremble, the sun and the moon grow dark, and the stars lose their brightness. The Lord utters His voice before His army. Surely His camp is very great. For strong is He who carries out His word. The day of the Lord is indeed great and very awesome, and who can endure it? Now, there's a question. I mean, it appears to me that, Joel and Isaiah are, one of them's quoting the other. And of course, which one you think is quoting the other depends on when you think Joel was written, because that Joel is like the most... Joel is the one book of the prophets that people argue more about when it was written and has the widest range of disagreement on. So if you think Joel came first, Isaiah is quoting Joel. And if you think Isaiah came first, then Joel's quoting Isaiah. But that's just something you got to leave to your own study. But what happens in the point of all of this is that the day of the Lord is a terrifying event for those who are not allied with God. But for those who are, it can be blessing. Now, this language of cosmic upheaval, the sun and the moon lose their light. The earth shakes. The heavens shake. What does that sound like? You draw a picture of that. What event does that sound like that's going to be? That sounds like the end of the world, doesn't it? I thought we were talking about Babylon. Why are we talking about the end of the world now? In verse 11 he even says, I will punish the world for its evil and the wicked for their iniquity. Mankind will be made scarcer than gold. Gold's not an easy thing to find. It's not in regular supply. The earth and the heavens both quake. You'd think those are the two things that aren't supposed to move. The ground's supposed to stay where it is and the sky's supposed to stay put. But they're both quaking and shaking because everything that we know about this universe is being completely destroyed and upheaved. Now from our perspective, in the 21st century, in our air-conditioned building, we talk about the fall of Babylon, and that's kind of, that's something, you kind of relegate into an ancient history textbook and maybe get a couple of pictures of ruins and things like that. And it's not really very emotionally significant to any of us. We don't have a lot of stake in that event. But suppose you were there when it happened. It's the end of the world. Everything's collapsed. Everything's gone to pieces. Everything that I knew about my way of life is gone. So it might as well be the end of the world. Mark, you had something.
We might reckon this to the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Mm-hmm. Right.
These were cities look around St. Petersburg. Here you had a city this size, and that bomb was dropped, and all of a sudden everything, there was, maybe a concrete brick wall sticking up here, nothing else involved, nothing else there.
End of the world.
And it was just devastation everywhere. So, you might liken it to that. I mean, just an atomic explosion here in St. Petersburg just levels everything. Yeah. Kills thousands and thousands of people. And that's the kind of devastation that we're talking about that happened there. And it can happen in this country.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, why does Isaiah use this end of the world language? Well, I mean, that's definitely one thought on that and I think that there's something to that. Another thought I had was that, every time God judges a nation, every time God judges a people, or every time there's some kind of disaster, it's just another reminder that the final judgment is coming. All of God's temporal judgments are ultimately pointers to the fact that a day is coming when He will one day judge the entire world in equity. And that's what the judgment on Babylon is. The scope of judgment on Babylon is greater than just Babylon itself. We read this oracle, as lengthy as it is, and kind of walk away with the impression, God really upset about that one city that most of us have never been to. Well, it's not like God's fanatically obsessed over one city and to the exclusion of everything else. No, Babylon is a part for the whole. It's a small-scale version of what God plans for the rest of humanity. And He makes the statement in verse 11, I will put an end to the arrogance of the proud and abase the haughtiness of the ruthless. Have we seen anything like that earlier in Isaiah? That sound familiar? That kind of talk? God's going to put an end to the proud. Isaiah hasn't had anything to say about the proud before. Isaiah's had a lot to say about the proud, hasn't he? Remember back in chapter 2? The Lord of hosts will have a day of reckoning against everyone who is proud and lofty, and against everyone who is lifted up that he may be abased. And he describes the cedars of Lebanon and the oaks of Bashan and the really tall mountains. He says all those people that just put themselves on a pedestal and them exalt themselves, God's going to have a day of reckoning against that. He says, and the Lord of hosts alone will be exalted in that day. Now that was against Israel that Isaiah said that. But here Isaiah says it against the pagans. He says it against Babylon. Is anybody exempt from God's judgment on the pride of humanity? No. This has been man's problem since day one. And it will continue to be man's problem until Christ returns. Man thinks too much of himself. He thinks that he's something. And really, he's not. Not before God, he's not. I will put an end to the arrogance of the proud. Mankind thinks too highly of himself. Why was the city of Babylon built? Well,
because man thought he was too proud.
Not because man thought he was too proud. Man thought he was important. In Genesis 11, they say, let us build a city, let us build a tower into heaven so that we can make a name for ourselves. All about pride there. God says, no, I'm going to put an end to that. And which is why Babylon is the prototypical world city. It's important to understand. Goes all the way back to Genesis 11 and that language that was used there. Now he goes on, and if anybody has any comments or questions, feel free to interject them. I'm kind of blazing through some of this. Mark,
thinking about our Sunday morning study in the book of Revelation, we're seeing a lot of similar type language that's used throughout these Old Testament prophets. So this is good reference material for us to be studying in preparation for Revelation to understand it properly.
Yeah, actually, Sunday morning sermon's going to be about Babylon. So, you're getting. I didn't plan it that way. I didn't plan them to overlap in our studies like that. That's just kind of one of those coincidences that happened. But there you go, Don.
The New Testament has places, but Galatians chapter 6 and verse 3. For if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself.
Yeah, there's definitely that element to it. Over and over again, this picture that Isaiah paints is that the one who humbles himself will be exalted, the one who exalts himself will be humbled. Yeah. Does sound like something Jesus would say. You think Jesus read Isaiah? Now, Isaiah says he saw Jesus. Well, John says Isaiah saw Jesus in the temple, Isaiah 6. Now, that's in John chapter 12, when he saw his glory. That's a whole other sermon. I'm going to get into that. We talked about that already. But in verse 14, we have kind of a more earthly graphic type description of the conquest. It will be like a hunted gazelle or like sheep with none to gather them. They will each turn to his own people. Each one will flee to his own land. Anyone who is found will be thrust through. Anyone who is captured will fall by the sword. Their little ones also will be dashed to pieces before their eyes. Their houses will be plundered and their wives ravished. Behold, I am going to stir up the Medes against them, who will not value silver or take pleasure in gold. Their bows will mow down the young men. They will not even have compassion on the fruit of the womb, nor will their eye pity children. And Babylon, the beauty of kingdoms, the glory of the Chaldeans' pride, will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. It will never be inhabited or lived in from generation to generation. Nor will the Arab pitch his tent there, nor will shepherds make their flocks lie down there, but desert creatures will lie down there, and their houses will be full of owls. Ostriches also will live there, and shaggy goats will frolic there. Hyenas will howl in their fortified towers, and jackals in their luxurious palaces. Her fateful time also will soon come, and her days will not be prolonged. Now that's pretty heavy-hitting stuff there. Verses 14 through 16 in particular have kind of described the limits of human atrocity. There's no escape. She's like a hunted gazelle. You can't escape attention. Like sheep without a shepherd. There's no one paying attention to you. In verse 15, anyone who's found is skewered. Anyone who's captured is killed because we're not taking any prisoners. The little ones are dashed in pieces. The houses are plundered. The wives are raped. This is frightening stuff. It is interesting. I do think this is giving us a background to the one of the difficult passages in the Psalms people always go on about. In Psalm 137, there's a song that people sing while they're captive in Babylon, and how they're weeping by the rivers. They can't sing the songs of Zion in a foreign land. And the last line of Psalm 137 says, "How blessed will be the one who takes your little ones and dashes them against the rock." And we think that's so horrifying and politically incorrect, and it's hard to get your mind around that. But when you see the background of Isaiah 13 and Isaiah's oracle against Babylon, you understand that the psalm is basically appealing to this oracle, is it not? The psalm is more or less calling on God to fulfill His promises. And as frightening as that language is, as terrifying and gut-wrenching as that is, the implication behind that is that there are times when it is appropriate to pray things like this, because you have an inspired example of it. You have that in the Psalms. And you have Isaiah saying, this is what God is going to do. This is the kind of judgment that God is going to exact because of the pride of mankind. That's what man has earned for himself. Something about a professor used the expression boulder bashing Babylon baby brains, which is a horrible way to put it. But that's I guess I repeated it, so I thought it was amusing at the time. But what is?
I thought that was great fun.
Yeah. But this is the kind of thing that Isaiah is talking about. The judgment of God. This is the limits of human atrocity right here, because this is what Babylon has earned for itself. This is where human pride gets you. And verses 17 and 18, he singles out a specific group, the Medes. Which the Medes can't be bought off. They don't value gold or silver. There's no compassion on young men or children. They shoot everybody. Interestingly, and this is the most specific Isaiah gets with how Babylon's going to fall, interestingly, the Medes are connected both with the fall of Assyria and Babylon in 609 and in 539. And so there you have an instance of prophecy fulfilling itself more than once. Human history just tends to repeat itself a lot. If you notice, it's like you read human history, how many times people try to invade Russia, and that always fails because winter strikes and nobody can outlast the troops with their military equipment. And so the Medes, Babylon or Assyria falling to the Medes is just again history repeating itself. Now, what kind of picture would you say Isaiah paints of Babylon? Do you have something?
Oh. Well, I was just saying that this reminded me of a little verse by Percy Shelley. Mm-hmm. It says, "I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed, and on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty in despair. Nothing remains besides. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away."
Doesn't that kind of say it right there? It's... this is Babylon is this glorious and magnificent city. She's going to be turned into a desolation. Just like Sodom and Gomorrah. No one's even going to pitch their tents there. There's going to be no shepherds bringing their sheep there. Instead, what happens? Babylon, who's going to live in Babylon now?
Demon goats?
Demon goats, yes. What is everybody's... I'm curious. In verse... I am curious about this. In verse 21, my version says ostriches and shaggy goats on the last line. What do the other versions say? It was a footnote. It was, the word there, sha'ir, is it's a word for shaggy goats or satyrs. The word is used in Leviticus 17:7, where God tells the people basically to stop sacrificing the goat demons. It's also used of Jeroboam's golden calves in 2 Chronicles 11:15. It's not a very common word, but now is Isaiah saying that the city is going to be inhabited by demons? Literally? I don't know. We might say it's a ghost town. Not that any of us believes in ghosts, but we still call something a ghost town when it's uninhabited, right? We kind of have that expression. But you have the unclean birds like owls and ostriches. You have unclean mammals like hyenas and jackals. And it is worth noting that the book of Revelation does echo the language of here when it says that fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place of demons and a prison of every unclean spirit and a prison of every unclean and hateful bird. Revelation 18 and verse 2. So, for what it's worth, he appears to be alluding to this passage anyway. Did you have something, Seth?
Yeah, in Daniel 8, where it talks about the shaggy goat representing Greece, is that the same word?
I don't think so. There's only 4 occurrences of the word, I think.
Okay. So it says shaggy goat here.
I have to double check, but I didn't see it in my list of references or write it down. I'll have to check. I'll let you know.
I got King James, New King James, American Standard, English Standard, and they all either say shaggy goats or wild goats.
See, this is where you need the paraphrases, because they're the ones that always come up with the creative stuff. But yes.
And my footnote,
Yeah, that's what Seth was saying too, and and it's possible. The word is used to mean goat demons in Leviticus 17. In Leviticus 17 in verse 7. All right, I feel like I already mentioned the reference, but I'll read it for you. That they shall no longer sacrifice their sacrifices to the goat demons with which they play the harlot. This shall be a permanent statute to them throughout their generations. And the word there is the same word in the Hebrew. It's also, like I said before, it's also used of Jeroboam's golden calves, which is kind of weird, but there is association in the Bible between idols and demons. And you can see that in Paul's writings, you can see that in Deuteronomy, you can see that in the Psalms. So it's not totally out of the ordinary. Now, when did Babylon become a desolation like this? When was this fulfilled? Jenna? Well, no, let's just talk about actual Babylon for a second. Is this what Babylon looks like today?
But it's not called Babylon.
It's not called Babylon.
It's called Damascus.
All right. Damascus?
Isn't it?
I think we need to check our geography there. Babylon is not. Baghdad's not built in the same place as Babylon was technically, but Babylon would be located in modern day Iraq.
I'm sorry.
They got pictures and stuff of the ruins and things like that. And the city itself is not inhabited. The original city that was built on the Euphrates River is no longer inhabited. The point is that. This didn't happen all at once. You think about when Sennacherib attacked Babylon in 689. You think about when Cyrus took the city of Babylon in 539. Did Babylon cease to exist at that point? No. You go in, you look around, Cyrus didn't destroy the city. He repossessed it for his own purposes. Now, the city was eventually abandoned in later times. And but it's just like every other world city. By the time of Alexander, the city was desolate. Alexander the Great said that he was going to rebuild it. And then he died before he could accomplish it. So, what do you do with that, right? But this principle of desolation or these other cities extends to other cities like Nineveh or Tyre. And so while Babylon was a glorious city, a great city, is Babylon, do you turn on your news channel and see Babylon all over your screen today? Do you hear people talking about Babylon and how they're the hot new world power? No. Why not? Because they were ultimately a city built by mankind. And it's not, even though Babylon was glorious, it is not man's glory that fills the earth. It is God's glory that must fill the earth, rather than humanity's. Jenna, did you have something? Oh, well, yeah, Alexander the Great's another instance. He said he was going to rebuild the city of Babylon, and then he didn't do it. He didn't live to see that project done. So, of course, some people will point to this and say, "See, it says it'll never be rebuilt." So, now you get to chapter 14, And, we're continuing this oracle. Seth, you have something?
How long before the Medes came to Babylon?
How long before? Well, I mean, the timeline, it's hard to date a lot of Isaiah's oracles because, you got about a 50-year time span that he's working in to begin with.
The last one, by the time Isaiah was done.
By the time Isaiah was, when Cyrus and the Medes and the Persians attacked Babylon would have been in 539. The fact that Isaiah specifically names the Medes here in chapter 13 is kind of interesting. Isaiah is definitely prophesying in the 700s, early 600s, so you figure there's got to be at least a century, probably a little more than that even. So, more. I'd say about no less than a century and a half.
So it'd be like someone at the Battle of Gettysburg predicting something about Kim Jong-un or whatever his name is.
Kind of. Isaiah definitely zeroes in on the specifics of it a little more. The really wild stuff is in chapter 45 when he basically, he surrounds it with all these statements about, God can predict the future. And then he says, by the way, Cyrus is the name of the ruler that's going to let the captives go. He singles them out. And Cyrus wasn't even born then. Didn't even exist at that point. Don?
Yeah, that's in verse 1.
Yeah. Yeah, Cyrus, my Messiah, my anointed one, yes. We'll talk about that when we get there. That's a long way off, but Jenna?
I was just going to say, so kind of like if you
You have to worry about those Germans. You're going to watch out for them. All right. Yeah, well, there you go, right? Well, and it wasn't like Babylon wasn't doing anything at this time either. Babylon's not the controlling world empire. But this is where we get in chapter 14. Who was king of Babylon at this time? When Isaiah writes, who is the king of Babylon?
Nabopolassar?
No. Well, it's a trick question, but depends. Well, the king of Babylon is whoever was in charge of the city and at the time, which Babylon changes several times, even during Isaiah's ministry. There's the real trick. And whenever an Assyrian king like Tiglath-Pileser or Sargon II or Sennacherib would take over the city of Babylon, they would claim for themselves the title King of Babylon. Now, which is kind of interesting because this oracle here is against the king of Babylon. Now, when they weren't in control of the city, they had a guy who actually was trying to take Babylon away from them, named Merodach-Baladan, or I forget what the actual pronunciation of that is in Babylonian, but Merodach-Baladan, who's mentioned in chapter 39, was the other king of Babylon who was constantly taking and retaking the city from the Assyrians. They take it away from him and send him into exile. Then he'd take it back when the new Assyrian emperor came, and they kick him out again. And Merodach-Baladan's the guy who tries to get Hezekiah to ally with him, and Hezekiah shows him all the treasures in his house, and Isaiah tells him afterwards, Babylon's going to come and take all that away from you eventually. But all that to say, we come to chapter 14. Chapter 14 is a taunt against the king of Babylon. When the Lord will have compassion on Jacob and again choose Israel and settle them in their own land, then strangers will join them and attach themselves to the house of Jacob. The peoples will take them along and bring them to their place. And the house of Israel will possess them as an inheritance in the land of the Lord, as male servants and female servants. They will take their captors captive. They will rule over their oppressors. And it will be in the day when the Lord gives you rest from your pain and turmoil and harsh service in which you have been enslaved, that you will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon and say, how the oppressor has ceased, how fury has ceased. The Lord has broken the staff of the wicked, the scepter of rulers, which used to strike the peoples in fury with unceasing strokes, which subdued the nations in anger with unrestrained persecution. The whole earth is at rest and is quiet. They break forth into shouts of joy. Even the cypress trees rejoice over you, and the cedars of Lebanon, saying, since you were laid low, no tree cutter comes up against us. Sheol from beneath is excited over you to meet you when you come. It arouses for you the spirits of the dead, all the leaders of the earth. It raises all the kings of the nations from their thrones. They will all respond and say to you, even you have been made weak as we. You have become like us. Your pomp and the music of your harps have been brought down to Sheol. Maggots are spread out as your bed beneath you, and worms are your covering. How you have fallen from heaven, O star of the morning, son of the dawn. You have been cut down to the earth, you who have weakened the nations. But you said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit on the mount of the assembly in the recesses of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. Nevertheless, you will be thrust down to Sheol, to the recesses of the pit. Those who see you will gaze at you. They will ponder over you, saying, is this the man who made the earth tremble? Who shook kingdoms? Who made the world like a wilderness and overthrew its cities? Who did not allow his prisoners to go home? All the kings of the nations lie in glory, each in his own tomb. But you have been cast out of your tomb like a rejected branch, clothed with the slain who are pierced with a sword, who go down to the stones of the pit like a trampled corpse. You will not be united with them in burial because you have ruined your country. You have slain your people. May the offspring of evildoers not be mentioned forever. Prepare for his sons a place of slaughter because of the iniquity of their fathers. They must not arise and take possession of the earth and fill the face of the world with cities. Now that's what they call a taunt song. And the whole point, you have examples of this elsewhere in Scripture. Exodus 15, whenever Israel crosses the Red Sea, Israel kind of sings a song against Pharaoh and his chariots, praising the Lord for destroying them. You read Judges 5, if you read Judges 5, after they defeat Jabin and Sisera, they go after Sisera's mother in that song, which is, kind of harsh, but, they start telling the story of how, Sisera's mother is looking out the window waiting for her son to come home, and he's not going to come home because he's dead. That's the whole point of the song in Judges 5. Ezekiel 28 has a taunt song against the king of Tyre, and so on. But the song is bookended by God's promises to judge Babylon and restore Israel. And the song is focused on Israel's restoration. You have this compassion. God will again choose Israel. There's going to be strangers joined to the house of Jacob that requires the gathering of the Gentiles to the mountain of God. Israel takes their captors captive and rules over them. It's an epic reversal. And then, when all these things happen, then Israel will take up this taunt. And the taunt song, this would be kind of cool to put in our songbooks, right? The taunt song has 4 stanzas. Verses 4 through 8 talk about the relief on the earth. Because he's gone, the whole earth has a reason to rejoice now. Verses 9 through 11, we have the astonishment in Sheol. Sheol is the Old Testament word for the realm of the dead. So whenever you have kind of this shock that goes on in the realm of the dead, like, how did he get here? And then in verses 12 through 15, we have a description of how the king himself is cast down to Sheol. And finally, in verses 16 through 21, we have talk about how he's treated on earth. He's disgraced on the earth. He's not given a proper burial. His descendants aren't able to carry on his line after him. Basically, all of his purposes have been totally overturned. So that's kind of the big bird's eye view of the taunt song. That clock on the back wall, it says I have several more hours, but I think real time says it's only 7:45. So, Seth, you got something?
12 through 15 sounds a whole lot like what they said at the Tower of Babel.
Oh, yes. We were gonna talk about that next time, but yes, verses 13 and 14 in particular. I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit in the mount of the assembly. I will ascend above the heights of the cloud. Doesn't that sound kind of like what they were saying when they said, hey, let's build the Tower of Babylon for ourselves. Let's build to heaven. But what does God say? You'll be thrust down to Sheol. Now verse 12 is kind of controversial too. People have interpreted that to refer to Satan, and I'm not going to tell you what I think about that. We'll wait till next time. We'll wait till next time and then we'll discuss that. Any comments or questions before we close? Huh?
You just chicken, that's all.
No, I have a long discussion on that on here. Just don't want to get into it now.
Can you come over here for a second?
So Wayne,